There is a question that almost nobody asks when they begin studying American history, and it is the most important question of all. The question is not who founded America, or when it was founded, or what documents were signed, or which battles were won. The question is this: what was here before? Not in the geological sense, though that story is extraordinary too. A continent carved by glaciers and erupted by volcanoes, and shaped by rivers over millions of years into the most ecologically diverse landmass in the northern hemisphere. No, the question is simpler and more human than that. What were the people here thinking, building, believing, and dreaming before the world they had constructed over 15,000 years was interrupted, and then shattered, and then rebuilt into something they would never have recognized? Because here is what most tellings of American history quietly skip over, or rush past in a paragraph, or reduce to a single sentence about Native Americans, as though 300 distinct civilizations can be collapsed into a single noun. Before 1492, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million human beings. Scholars continue to debate the precise figure, and the truth is, we may never know it exactly, because so many of those people and their records were destroyed before anyone thought to count them carefully. But the range itself tells you something. We are not talking about a handful of scattered bands of nomads moving across an empty continent. We are talking about a population roughly equivalent to the population of Europe at the same time, distributed across 2 continents, organized into hundreds of distinct political entities, speaking over 300 languages, practicing dozens of different religions, maintaining trade networks that stretched thousands of miles, building cities, writing calendars, irrigating deserts, managing forests, and doing all the things that human beings do when they have been living somewhere for a very long time and have figured out how it works. That is where this story begins. Not in 1776, not in 1620, not even in 1492. It begins in the deep past, on a continent that was already old when Europe was still learning what a city was, among people who had developed answers to the fundamental questions of human existence: how to feed a community, how to govern a people, how to make meaning in a world that offers no instruction manual, and whose answers were, in many ways, more sophisticated than anything their eventual conquerors would bring. Understanding that is not optional background information. It is the foundation without which nothing that follows makes sense. Because the story of the United States is, at its most essential level, the story of what happens when one civilization builds itself on the ruins of others, carries the memory of that destruction in its legal codes and its land titles and its political philosophy, and then spends the next 2 centuries trying to reconcile the ideals it proclaimed at its founding with the methods it used to make those ideals possible. That reconciliation is still underway, which is why this history, of all histories, is worth telling slowly. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being told your history began when someone else decided to notice you. Generations of American schoolchildren were taught, in a tradition so persistent it became invisible, that the story of their country began with European arrival, that everything before 1492 was a kind of prelude, a stage being set for the main event. The people who lived here before Columbus were described, when they were described at all, as context rather than protagonists, background rather than foreground, the scenery rather than the play. This framing was not accidental. It served specific interests. It made the appropriation of a continent easier to narrate If the continent could be understood as essentially empty before it was found, empty of the particular kinds of history that the dominant culture recognized as history. No writing meant no records. No writing meant no history. No history meant no real civilization. No civilization meant no real claim to the land. The logic was circular and self-serving, and it has been doing its work in American culture for 4 centuries. The work of this opening act is to break that frame, not to replace it with a romanticized counter-narrative of a perfect indigenous world tragically destroyed by evil Europeans. That substitution would be as historically dishonest as the original, just in the opposite direction. The work is to restore specificity, scale, and genuine respect for the complexity of what was here. To treat the pre-contact Americas as the history that they were, rather than as the prologue to somebody else's history. Because if you start the story of the United States in 1776, you are starting in the middle of a sentence. If you start in 1607 at Jamestown, you are still in the middle. If you start in 1492, you are getting closer to the beginning. But even 1492 is not the beginning. The beginning is when human beings first walked onto this continent, looked around at the rivers and the mountains and the forests and the endless grasslands, and began the long process of learning how to live here. That beginning was 15,000 years ago, at minimum, possibly more. The history that followed that beginning was as rich, as complex, and as worth telling as any history on Earth. So that is where we begin. Not at the founding documents, not at the first colonial settlement, not even at the moment of first contact. We begin in the deep past, on a continent that was already old, among people who had already been doing the hard work of civilization for thousands of years. We begin, as all honest history should begin, with what was actually there. Let us go back to the very beginning of the human story on this continent, because the beginning itself contains something psychologically important, a reminder that what seems permanent and inevitable is almost never either of those things. About 20,000 years ago, the Earth was locked in the last great ice age. The polar ice caps were dramatically larger than they are today, and because so much of the planet's water was frozen and stored at the poles, sea levels were significantly lower, in some places by hundreds of feet. The floor of what we now call the Bering Strait, the narrow body of water that separates Siberia from Alaska, was exposed. It was not a thin strip of land, the kind you could walk across in an afternoon. It was a landmass, perhaps 1,000 miles wide, grassy and tundra-like, with animals grazing on it, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, ancient horses and camels, species that are now extinct but were abundant then. Archaeologists and geologists call this landmass Beringia. Across Beringia, following the animals they hunted and driven by all the ordinary human reasons for movement, curiosity, resource scarcity, conflict, the simple restlessness that seems to be built into our species, small groups of people from northeastern Asia walked, or waded, or paddled along the coastline into a continent that had never before held a human footprint. They did not know they were making history. They did not know they were on a continent. They were just moving, as humans have always moved, toward food and safety and the possibility of something better just over the next ridge. The date of this first arrival is a question that archaeologists have been revising steadily for decades, and the honest answer is that the science keeps pushing it further back. For a long time, the standard account held that humans arrived in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago, based on a distinctive style of stone tool called Clovis points found across the continent. But evidence has accumulated at sites from Chile to South Carolina, suggesting human presence significantly earlier than that, perhaps 15,000 years ago, perhaps 20,000. Some disputed evidence still being evaluated hints at dates even older than that. The science is live and contested, and that is itself a reminder that our knowledge of the deep past is always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence surfaces. What is not contested is that once humans arrived, they spread. Over thousands of years, the descendants of those first arrivals moved across the continent and then down through Central America and into South America, reaching the tip of Patagonia, the southernmost inhabited point on Earth. In a period of time that is remarkable for its speed relative to the distances involved. By 10,000 years ago, human beings had colonized virtually every habitable environment in the Western Hemisphere, from the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the tropical rainforests of the Amazon, from the high-altitude Andes to the temperate coastlines of what would become California. Each environment required adaptation, invention, and the accumulation of specialized knowledge that could only be built over generations. This is the psychological truth that tends to get lost in the rush to get to the real history. The people who were living in North America in 1491 were not primitive. They were not people who had been standing still for 15,000 years while Europe progressed. They were the inheritors of 15,000 years of accumulated knowledge, experiment, failure, and refinement. They had figured out how to survive and then how to thrive in every ecological niche the continent offered. They had developed languages of extraordinary complexity, spiritual traditions of remarkable depth, political systems of genuine sophistication, and economic arrangements that were, in their own terms, highly efficient. Picture the world of 20,000 years ago, not as a deficient version of today, lacking our technology and our density and our interconnectedness. Picture it as its own complete world, operating according to its own ecology and its own climate, just as real and just as full as ours, different in almost every particular. The glaciers are 2 miles thick over what will become Chicago and New York. The sea levels are so much lower that much of the continental shelf off the Atlantic coast is dry land. The Great Plains are not yet the sea of grass we know. They are a mosaic of grasslands and woodlands, grazed by megafauna that have no equivalents today. The giant ground sloth, the size of an elephant, the American mastodon, the American mammoth, ancient camels and horses whose descendants will return to the continent on Spanish ships 15,000 years later. Into this world, people walked. They did not know it was a new world. There was no concept of new world available to them. There was only the world, the place where they and their parents and their grandparents and every ancestor they could name had always lived, which now extended in a new direction. The transition from Siberia to Alaska, following the shoreline of Beringia or tracking herds across its interior, would not have felt like a historic crossing. It would have felt like Tuesday, like following the animals one more day's walk in the direction the animals were going. The ecological intelligence required to survive in that environment was extraordinary. The people who made this crossing were not stumbling blindly through an unknown wilderness. They were expert trackers, expert foragers, expert readers of landscape and weather, and animal behavior. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They knew how to find water in a dry landscape. They knew how to make fire in the rain. They knew how to skin an animal, preserve its meat, use its bones for tools, and its hide for clothing. This knowledge had been accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution in the Old World, and it came with them. It was the most valuable thing they carried. The spread of these first Americans southward from Alaska occurred over thousands of years, following ecological corridors through and around the retreating glaciers. The western coast of North America, where the Cascades and other coastal ranges rise steeply from the Pacific, offered a route even before the interior ice-free corridor opened. The mountains catch moisture from the Pacific and hold the glaciers high. The narrow coastal strip below was likely ice-free even at the height of the last glacial maximum. Kelp forests offshore would have provided reliable food. The people could have moved southward along the coast, in boats or on foot, finding food in the intertidal zones and estuaries, making camp on beaches and rocky shores, generation by generation, extending the southward edge of the human world. By the time the glaciers retreated enough to open the interior of the continent, roughly 14,000 years ago, human beings had likely already reached the southern tip of South America. The archaeology of Monte Verde in Chile, dated to approximately 14,500 years ago, sits 12,000 miles from the Bering Land Bridge. The human expansion across two continents was happening at a speed that, by the standards of population spread in the ancient world, was remarkably fast. It was not fast by modern standards. It was measured in generations, not years. But it speaks to the adaptability and restlessness of the human species. The persistent drive to move toward new resources and new possibilities that has characterized our species from its origins in Africa. Each group that moved into a new environment had to learn it from scratch, had to figure out which animals could be hunted and how, which plants were nourishing, where the water was seasonal and where it was reliable, what the weather was going to do, how to build shelter against the particular combination of cold and wind and wet that the new place offered. This learning was not easy. There were failures. Groups that moved into new environments without adequate knowledge sometimes did not survive. The ones that did survive built up local knowledge that they passed on to their children, who refined it and passed it on to their children, who refined it further, until after many generations the people of a particular place had an intimate, detailed, comprehensive understanding of its ecology that no outside observer could have matched. This is what anthropologists mean when they talk about traditional ecological knowledge. Not folk belief or pre-scientific superstition, but empirically tested, multi-generational, practical wisdom about the specific ecological system in which a community lives. The knowledge of which plants bloom first in spring, which indicates that the salmon run is coming. The knowledge of which direction the wind comes from before a particular kind of storm. The knowledge of how deep you have to dig in a particular dry wash to find water in August. The knowledge of which springs dry up in drought years and which never do. This knowledge took thousands of years to accumulate, and it was carried in the language, the ceremonies, the stories, and the practices of the people who built it. It was, and is, one of the most sophisticated forms of knowledge that human beings have ever produced. When European colonists arrived and declared the land terra nullius, empty land, belonging to no one, they were not just making a legal argument, they were making an epistemological claim. that the only knowledge that counted was the kind that could be written down, the kind that looked like European knowledge. The vast, sophisticated, tested body of ecological knowledge that indigenous peoples carried was invisible to them, or was visible but did not count. The land was unused because it was not being used in the way European land was used. The people were savages because their sophistication expressed itself in forms that European culture had not developed and therefore could not recognize. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, civilized, just not in the particular way that word would eventually be defined by the people who arrived to displace them. There is a place in the American Midwest, just east of where the city of St. Louis now stands, where the earth rises in ways that don't quite look natural. If you drive past it on Interstate 55 in southern Illinois, you might notice what appears to be a large, flat-topped hill rising from the floodplain of the Mississippi River. You might assume it is a geological formation of some kind, a remnant of some ancient glacial process. You would be wrong. What you are looking at is Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in the Americas north of Mexico. It covers an area of about 14 acres at its base, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises in 4 broad terraces to a height of about 100 feet. On its summit, there once stood a large wooden building, perhaps the residence or ceremonial hall of the most powerful person in the city that surrounded it. That city was called Cahokia, though we do not know what its residents called it. At its peak, somewhere around the year 1050 of the Common Era, 500 years before Columbus sailed, it had a population that archaeologists estimate at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with another 20 to 30,000 living in surrounding communities within a day's walk. It was, by any reasonable standard, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. London, in the year 1050, had perhaps 10,000 people. Paris was comparable. Cahokia was as large as both. The city covered an area of roughly 6 square miles and contained over 100 earthen mounds of various sizes and shapes, each serving different ceremonial, administrative, or residential functions. The central plaza, a cleared and leveled area of about 50 acres directly in front of Monk's Mound, was almost certainly used for large public gatherings, ceremonies, and the kind of civic life that requires open communal space. The entire urban landscape was, according to the archaeological evidence, carefully planned. This was not a settlement that grew organically from a small village. It was designed. Someone, at some point, made decisions about where the mounds would go, how the plaza would be oriented, how the streets would run. Cahokia also shows evidence of what archaeologists call woodhenge, a series of large wooden posts arranged in circles that, when analyzed, appeared to mark the solstices and equinoxes. The people of Cahokia were tracking the sun with precision. They were encoding astronomical knowledge into their built environment. They were doing, in other words, what every sophisticated civilization does. They were using architecture and public ritual to communicate shared beliefs about the nature of time, the cosmos, and the community's place within it. And then, sometime around 1300 or 1350, the city was abandoned. The population dispersed, the wooden buildings rotted and fell. The mounds remained silent and enormous, long after the people who built them had moved on. This epistemological blindness was not unique to Europeans. Every culture tends to see what it expects to see and miss what it has no category for. But the consequences of this particular blindness were world historical in their scale, and they run directly from that original misrecognition to the dispossessions, the wars, the forced removals, and the cultural destructions that followed. The story of Cahokia is a story about power, about how power is built, how it legitimizes itself, how it extracts surplus from a larger population in exchange for the promise of order and cosmic alignment, and what happens when that promise can no longer be kept. In this sense, it is a story that will repeat itself in every civilization this history touches. The specific content changes. The structural dynamics are remarkably consistent. Cahokia grew rapidly. The archaeological evidence suggests that it went from a modest village to a major urban center in a period of perhaps 1 or 2 generations. Around the year 1050 CE, this rapid growth is itself puzzling and has generated considerable scholarly debate. What happened? What caused people from a wide surrounding area to converge on this particular location and begin building at this particular scale? The most convincing explanation involves a combination of factors that reinforced each other. The location itself was exceptional, at the confluence of the Missouri, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers, with access to the resources of multiple ecological zones, including the rich agricultural land of the Mississippi floodplain, the forests of the uplands, and the fish and waterfowl of the rivers. The location was also a nexus of existing trade routes. Whoever controlled it controlled access to the movement of goods across a very large territory, but location alone does not explain the scale and speed of Cahokia's growth. Something else was happening. The emergence of a powerful new religious and political ideology that provided a compelling reason for people to contribute labor, surplus food, and loyalty to a central authority. The archaeological evidence of this ideology is written in the mounds themselves, in the burials found within them, and in the artifacts recovered from the site. We do not know exactly why Cahokia declined. The most likely explanations involve a combination of factors: drought, which archaeological evidence of tree rings and soil samples supports, combined with the ecological strain of a large population depleting local resources, combined perhaps with political instability as the centralized authority that had organized the cities. Construction could no longer deliver the agricultural surpluses that justified its power. This pattern, a civilization that climbs to great heights, puts too much pressure on the system that sustains it, and then contracts, is not unique to Cahokia. It is one of the most consistent stories in human history, relevant in ways that extend well beyond the pre-Columbian Americas. But the story of Cahokia's rise is at least as important as the story of its fall, because it tells us something crucial. The Mississippi River Valley, the heart of what would become the United States, was not an untouched wilderness in the centuries before European contact. It had already been the site of urban civilization. The land had already been worked, shaped, managed, and meaning-laden long before any European imagined it existed. 1,000 miles to the northeast of Cahokia, in the region of upstate New York that the geography textbooks describe as the Finger Lakes country, a landscape of long, narrow glacial lakes, lying in parallel rows like the fingers of an outstretched hand. Something was taking shape in the political realm that would eventually have profound consequences for the entire subsequent history of North America, though it would take several centuries for that influence to become visible. The story begins, as many political origin stories do, with a period of terrible violence. The 5 nations of the northeastern woodlands, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida, and the Seneca, each occupying their own territory in a rough east-to-west sequence across what is now upstate New York, had been locked for what the oral traditions describe as generations, in cycles of devastating intertribal warfare. The violence was not random chaos. It had its own logic, its own rituals, its own escalating patterns of raid and counter-raid, captive-taking, and revenge-killing that made it self-perpetuating in the way that cycles of violence tend to be. Each act of killing generated an obligation of revenge, which generated another act of killing, which generated another obligation of revenge. And so the spiral turned. Into this world came a figure that the oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee, the name these nations gave to their confederacy, usually translated as people of the Longhouse, remember as the great peacemaker. His name, in the Mohawk language, was Daganoweda, though in many of the oral traditions it is considered too sacred to speak aloud, and he is referred to simply by his title. He came, the traditions say, from the north, from across the water, born of a virgin mother in circumstances that carried spiritual significance, a detail that tells you something about the theological way these traditions placed on his mission. The Great Peacemakers Project was to end the cycle of violence by creating a new political framework, working alongside a Mohawk man named Hiawatha, a different Hiawatha from the one Longfellow invented for his 19th century poem, which was largely fictional. The great peacemaker traveled from nation to nation, making the case for what he called the good mind, a philosophy of peace, rationality, and collective governance that he believed could replace the endless cycle of killing with something more sustainable. The result of this diplomacy was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known in the historical literature as the Iroquois League or the Iroquois Confederacy. Its founding document is the Great Law of Peace, Gayanoshagawa, in the Onondaga language, a set of principles and procedures for collective governance that scholars have been studying and debating for more than 2 centuries. The Great Law established a federal structure with a central council of 50 chiefs, drawn from the member nations in proportions that reflected their respective sizes and historical roles. Meeting regularly at Onondaga, the central nation geographically, it established procedures for consensus decision-making, for the resolution of disputes between nations, for the adoption of new members, and for the removal of leaders who abused their authority. This last feature is worth pausing on. The Haudenosaunee Great Law included provisions for something that functions recognizably as impeachment, a mechanism by which leaders who violated their responsibilities could be removed from office. The clan mothers of each nation held the authority to warn and ultimately to depose leaders whose conduct was unacceptable. This was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was a system with genuine accountability mechanisms, genuine checks on individual power, and a genuine principle that leadership was a responsibility rather than a privilege. One of the most remarkable of these burials is what archaeologists call Mound 72, a burial that tells a story of extraordinary power, concentration, and ritual sacrifice. At the center of the mound, a man was buried on a platform of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him were the remains of at least 250 other people, many of them young women buried in mass graves that show signs of having been sacrificed. Nearby, 4 headless and handless men were buried together. The entire complex speaks of a society in which the paramount leader, the person in the falcon bed, was understood to have supernatural authority, and in which that authority was demonstrated through the controlled death of subordinates. This is a pattern that recurs in the archaeological record of complex chiefdom societies around the world. At a certain level of political centralization, elites begin to demonstrate their power through the conspicuous consumption of human life. It is disturbing, and it should be. It is also, in the context of the political and religious logic that produced it, comprehensible. The paramount chief of Cahokia was not understood to be merely a political leader. He was understood to be a figure who stood at the intersection of the human and divine worlds, a cosmological axis, a person through whom the fertility of the land, the regularity of the seasons, and the prosperity of the community were mediated. His death ceremonies were understood to be cosmologically necessary, not merely politically convenient. The economic organization of Cahokia was a redistribution economy on a grand scale. Agricultural surplus from the surrounding farmlands flowed into the city, where it was redistributed through feasting, ceremonies, and the maintenance of the workforce that built and maintained the mounds. The sheer scale of the mound-building enterprise, Monk's Mound alone, involved moving roughly 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried basket by basket without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, required an organizational capacity to mobilize large numbers of workers over an extended period. Workers had to be fed, which meant surplus had to be stored and managed, which meant a bureaucratic apparatus of some kind, even if not in a form we would recognize. The trade networks that connected Cahokia to the wider world were extensive. Copper from the Great Lakes, chert from distant quarries, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, and other prestige goods from across the continent found their way to Cahokia, demonstrating that the city was a node in a vast network of exchange. These goods were not primarily for everyday use. They were for ceremony, for elite display, for the maintenance of relationships with distant peoples. They were the diplomatic currency of a world organized around the exchange of prestige rather than the exchange of standardized commodities. And then the decline. The population that had been drawn to Cahokia by the promise of order and abundance was, at some point in the 13th century, drawn away from it again. The droughts that tree ring records document would have undermined the agricultural surpluses that the redistribution economy depended on. When the chief could no longer deliver abundance, when the ceremonies stopped working, when the harvests kept failing, when the promise of cosmic alignment proved hollow, the ideology that had justified his power began to lose its grip. People vote with their feet. They left. The mounds remained, too large to be dismantled, too dense to be easily farmed over. The city emptied. The memory of what it had been faded. When European settlers moved into the Illinois prairie in the 19th century, they noticed the mounds but did not understand them, and in many cases simply farmed over the smaller ones. The largest mounds survived because they were too large to plow under, not because anyone recognized their significance. The date of the Confederacy's founding is another area of scholarly debate. The oral traditions point to a time before European contact, and some scholars, using astronomical evidence within the oral traditions, a reference to a solar eclipse described in connection with the founding council, have argued for dates as early as 1090 CE or 1142 CE. Other scholars prefer a later date, in the 15th century, closer to European contact. The honest answer is that we do not know precisely, and the uncertainty matters less than the basic fact. By the time Europeans arrived in significant numbers in the northeastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a functioning, sophisticated, multi-generational political institution with deep roots and genuine authority. The question of whether the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced the framers of the American Constitution has been debated with sometimes remarkable intensity, partly because the answer has political implications in both directions. What is clear from the historical record is that the founders were aware of the Haudenosaunee model. Benjamin Franklin attended councils of the Confederacy. In 1744, the Onondaga diplomat, Canasatego, explicitly advised the colonial delegates at the Treaty of Lancaster to form a union similar to the Haudenosaunee one, telling them that the colonies were like the individual nations before the great peacemaker, strong separately, but stronger together, and less prone to being played against each other by outside powers. Franklin published the proceedings of that council and distributed them widely. The Albany Plan of Union that Franklin proposed in 1754 has structural similarities to the Haudenosaunee system that are difficult to explain as coincidental. How direct the influence was, how consciously the founders drew on the Haudenosaunee example, remains contested. But the larger point does not depend on resolving that contest. The point is simply this: a working federal republic with genuine representation, genuine accountability, and genuine longevity existed in northeastern North America for centuries before 1787. The idea that the United States invented republican self-governance was always a convenient myth told by people who had decided not to see what was in front of them. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the great city of Cahokia are perhaps the most dramatic examples of political and urban sophistication in pre-contact North America, but they are not exceptional. The continent was full of developed civilizations, each adapted to its particular ecological and historical circumstances, each carrying its own body of knowledge, its own political arrangements, its own spiritual traditions. In the desert Southwest, the Pueblo peoples, the ancestors of the Hopi-Zuni, and other nations still living in the region today, had been building permanent stone and adobe structures since at least 700 CE. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they had constructed extraordinary multi-story complexes in places like Chaco Canyon in what is now New Mexico and Mesa Verde in what is now Colorado. Chaco Canyon, at its height around 1100 CE, was the center of a regional exchange network that covered an area of roughly 100,000 square miles. The great houses of Chaco, buildings with hundreds of rooms, some rising 4 or 5 stories, were aligned with astronomical precision. Roads radiated out from the canyon in straight lines across the desert for dozens of miles, engineered with fills and cuts to maintain their linearity, even across rough terrain. Chaco was clearly a center of religious, economic, and political significance for a very wide region, though the exact nature of its authority over outlying communities continues to be studied. In the Pacific Northwest, the abundant salmon runs of the coastal rivers and the rich marine environment of the coast had made possible cultures of remarkable material wealth and artistic sophistication. Nations like the Tlingit, Haida Chinook, and others had developed complex social hierarchies, elaborate ceremonial traditions, including the potlatch, a feast and gift-giving ceremony in which wealth was not hoarded but distributed and displayed, and an artistic tradition in wood carving, weaving, and other media that ranks among the most distinctive and accomplished in the world. The totem poles that have become one of the most recognized symbols of Pacific Northwest cultures were not random decorations. They were genealogical documents, political statements, and spiritual records carved in cedar, narrating the histories of the families and clans that owned them. In the southeast, the nations that Europeans would later call the five civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, and dozens of others, were the inheritors of the Mississippian mound-building tradition that Cahokia represented. They farmed the rich river valleys of the southeast with the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a polycultural system that maintained soil fertility, maximized caloric yield per acre, and provided a nutritionally balanced diet, and chiefs and recognized legal systems for managing disputes. Monk's Mound is a state historic site today. You can climb it. From the top, on a clear day, you can see the St. Louis Arch across the river. The juxtaposition is striking, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork north of Mexico, and the gateway to the American West, 500 years of American history, visible in a single glance. The mound remembers something the arch does not, that the expansion westward was not into empty land, but into land that had been inhabited, managed, and made meaningful for longer than anyone in Washington or London could easily imagine. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace is not easy to summarize, partly because it exists in multiple versions, transmitted through different oral traditions and transcribed at different times by different recorders, and partly because its full text is long and detailed in ways that resist simple paraphrase. But its core principles are identifiable and worth dwelling on, because they represent a genuine achievement in political philosophy. The first principle is peace itself, not merely the absence of war, but a positive condition of right relationship between peoples, based on the recognition of shared humanity and mutual obligation. The great peacemaker's vision was not just a ceasefire between five warring nations. It was a new understanding of the political world, in which the resort to violence was understood as a failure of rationality, a sign that the good mind, the ability to think clearly and generously, had been overcome by the emotions of grief and anger. On the Great Plains, before the reintroduction of the horse by the Spanish in the 16th and 17th centuries, nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were not yet the equestrian hunter societies they would become. They were semi-sedentary, farming along river valleys in the eastern plains, making seasonal hunts on foot for the buffalo that grazed the grasslands in herds of inconceivable size. Herds that may have numbered 60 million animals across the entire plains. The relationship between these peoples and the buffalo was not simply economic. It was spiritual, reciprocal, and deeply embedded in their cosmologies. The buffalo gave everything: food, clothing, tools, shelter, fuel, and the people, in their understanding of the world, gave something back. The ceremonies, the prayers, the careful hunting practices that honored the spirit of what was taken and asked permission for what would be taken again. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, the Inuit and their linguistic relatives had developed technologies for living in the most extreme cold climate environment on the inhabited planet. The kayak, the umiak, the igloo, the harpoon with its detachable head, the dog sled. These were not simple inventions. They represented centuries of iterative engineering, tested against conditions in which a single failure could mean death. The knowledge embedded in these technologies was comprehensive, detailed, and precise. It was also, like most indigenous knowledge, transmitted primarily through oral tradition and apprenticeship rather than writing, which made it invisible to European observers who equated literacy with intelligence and missed entirely what was being communicated through demonstration and practice. The point of this survey is not to be exhaustive, but to convey the sheer scale and diversity of what existed. North America in 1491 was not empty. It was not primitive. It was not waiting. It was full, complex, varied, and alive in every possible sense of that word. Before we move forward into the catastrophe that is about to begin, there is one more dimension of pre-contact life that deserves careful attention, because it is the dimension that perhaps most profoundly shaped the collision that was coming, the spiritual and philosophical frameworks through which indigenous peoples understood their relationship to the land, to time, and to each other. The diversity of indigenous spiritual traditions across the continent is so vast that it is genuinely impossible to generalize without distortion. Each nation had its own cosmology, its own ceremonies, its own sacred stories, its own understanding of the nature of reality. Any attempt to reduce this diversity to a single Native American religion does violence to the specificity of each tradition. And yet, across this diversity, there are certain broad orientations that recur with enough frequency to be worth noting, not because they were universal, but because they represented a fundamentally different relationship to the world than the one the Europeans were about to bring. One of the most striking of these orientations is the understanding of land. In the dominant European legal and philosophical tradition, land was property. It could be owned by individuals, bought and sold, inherited, divided, and used without regard for any obligation beyond what contracts and laws specified. The relationship to land was, at its core, a relationship of dominion, a word with deep theological roots in the book of Genesis, where God instructs humanity to have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Land was a resource to be exploited in the service of human ends. The psychological dimension of this vision is worth pausing on. The Great Law understands political conflict in psychological terms. The cycle of violence that had gripped the 5 nations was not merely a strategic problem to be solved through superior force or better alliances. It was, at its root, a psychological problem. The inability of grieving people to think clearly enough to break the cycle that their grief was perpetuating. The great peacemaker's intervention was as much therapeutic as political. He worked to help the leaders he was trying to persuade to process their grief, to come out from under the weight of loss and vengeance, to be able to hear and consider new ideas. Hiawatha, his closest collaborator, was himself a man who had lost his family to violence. His daughters had been killed, and his grief had initially blocked his ability to hear the message of peace. The great peacemaker helped him grieve, helped him find a way to move through the loss without being defined by it. And Hiawatha then carried that experience into his diplomacy with others who were similarly stuck in cycles of grief and revenge. This is the origin of the condolence ceremony, the Haudenosaunee practice of ceremonially lifting the grief of those who have lost someone, clearing the mind so that the living can return to the obligations of the present. The condolence ceremony is still practiced today at every Grand Council meeting, and its psychological wisdom is remarkable. The governance structure that the Great Law created was sophisticated and self-consciously designed to manage the competing interests of 5 distinct nations while maintaining their unity. The 50 chiefs of the Grand Council were not simply representatives of their nations. They were understood to be the embodiment of the Confederacy's values, obligated to think of the welfare of the whole rather than merely the interests of the part. A chief who brought a narrow parochial perspective to the council was failing in his duty. The obligation was always to seek the course of action that served the Confederacy as a whole, even when that required sacrifice from one's own nation. Decision-making in the Grand Council was by consensus, not majority vote, but the genuine agreement of all parties. This was slower than majority voting, and it could be frustrating when agreement was difficult to reach. But it had a structural wisdom that majority voting lacks. It required the minority to be genuinely heard and addressed, rather than simply outvoted. A decision that left a significant minority deeply aggrieved was, in the Haudenosaunee understanding, not a real decision. It was a temporary imposition that would generate resistance and eventually unravel. True consensus, the kind that people had genuinely agreed to rather than merely accepted because they had lost a vote, was more durable, even if it took longer to achieve. The role of women in the Haudenosaunee political system deserves more than the brief mention it usually receives in general histories. Clan mothers were not merely behind-the-scenes influencers who shaped the choices of male leaders. They were structural participants in governance with specific, defined, and genuine authority. They nominated the chiefs. They had the power to remove chiefs who were not performing their duties properly. They managed the longhouses, the communal residences that were the basic economic unit of Haudenosaunee society. And in doing so, they controlled the material resources that undergirded political authority. A chief who lost the confidence of the clan mothers had lost the foundation of his power. For most indigenous peoples of North America, this understanding was not merely wrong, it was incomprehensible. Land was not property. Land was a living system, a web of relationships between creatures and plants and waters and spirits, in which human beings were participants rather than owners. The idea that a person could own a piece of land in the way they owned a tool or a garment would have struck many indigenous thinkers as roughly equivalent to claiming to own the wind. The land had its own existence, its own rights, its own claims on the people who lived within it. This did not mean that indigenous peoples had no relationship to specific territories, or that there were no concepts of use rights, hunting territories, or recognized boundaries between nations. There were. The point is not that everything was held in common with no distinctions. The point is that the fundamental conceptual framework, the lens through which the human-land relationship was understood, was relational rather than proprietary, reciprocal rather than exploitative. A related orientation involves time. In the dominant European Christian tradition of the period, time was linear. It had a beginning, in the creation described in Genesis, and it was moving toward an end, the second coming and the last judgment. History was a story of fall and redemption, moving in one direction toward a divine conclusion. This linear conception of time had profound implications for how European societies understood progress, change, and the relationship between past and future. Many indigenous cosmologies organized time quite differently. Time was cyclical, organized around the rhythms of seasons, agricultural cycles, celestial movements, and the recurring patterns of birth, growth, death, and renewal that governed the natural world. History was not a march toward somewhere new, but a spiral returning to familiar patterns, each cycle carrying the echoes of all the cycles before it. The ceremonies that marked seasonal transitions were not simply celebrations of nature. They were active participations in the cycle, ways of ensuring that the sun would return, the rains would come, the salmon would run, the corn would grow. And then there is the concept that has become perhaps the most widely discussed aspect of indigenous philosophy in recent decades: the principle of thinking 7 generations ahead. This idea that decisions should be evaluated against their consequences for people who will be alive 7 generations from now, roughly 140 years in the future, appears in various forms across multiple indigenous traditions, most prominently in Haudenosaunee teachings. It is not simply an ecological principle, though it has ecological implications. It is a theory of responsibility, a claim that the people alive today have obligations to people who do not yet exist, that the future has a legitimate claim on present decisions. The contrast with the short-term thinking that governed much of European colonial capitalism, where the relevant horizon was often a single growing season, a single trading voyage, a single political administration, could not have been more stark. One worldview asked, what will the consequences of this action be in 140 years? The other asked, what is the return on this investment this quarter? This is not, to be clear, a modern feminist arrangement, and divisions of labor that would not map neatly onto contemporary ideals of equality. But it was a genuinely different distribution of political power than anything in contemporary Europe, where women had no formal political rights and were legally subordinate to male family members in virtually every domain of life. The Haudenosaunee system had found a way to institutionalize the political authority of women that European political philosophy would not seriously begin to consider for another 3 centuries. The longevity of the Confederacy is itself evidence of its effectiveness. It survived the catastrophic population losses of the epidemic era, the pressure of European colonial expansion. The French and English imperial wars fought partly on Haudenosaunee territory, and the American Revolution, in which the Confederacy was ultimately split, with some nations supporting the British and others, the Americans, a division from which it did not fully recover politically. It still exists today, continuing to hold Grand Council meetings at Onondaga, continuing to practice the condolence ceremony, continuing to teach the great law. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is one of the oldest continuously operating governmental institutions in the world. That fact is almost never mentioned in American civics education. The diversity of pre-contact North America is, in a sense, the whole point. The continent was not a uniform thing. It was a collection of very different ecological zones, inhabited by very different peoples, each of whom had developed specific adaptations to their specific environment. Any attempt to talk about Native Americans as a single group with a single culture and a single political reality is a distortion so severe it approaches falsehood. The Cherokee were not the Lakota. The Haudenosaunee were not the Pueblo peoples. The Tlingit were not the Ojibwe. They lived in different climates, ate different foods, built different structures, spoke different languages, organized their political lives differently, and understood the cosmos differently. This diversity was not a sign of backwardness. It was the product of successful adaptation to an enormous range of environments. The people of the Arctic had solved the problem of surviving in conditions that regularly killed European explorers, even after centuries of contact with clothing technology, food preservation methods, and navigational knowledge that represented genuine scientific achievement. The people of the Great Basin had learned to survive in one of the most arid environments in North America, finding food and water where European travelers died of thirst. The people of the Pacific Northwest had developed a material culture of extraordinary richness in response to an environment of exceptional ecological productivity. The people of the Southwest had mastered desert agriculture through irrigation systems that are still studied by hydrological engineers today. To see all of this as a single, undifferentiated Native American culture is to do what the colonists did, to see only that these peoples were not European, and to miss everything that made them specifically what they were. The diversity itself was a form of knowledge, evidence of 15,000 years of human problem-solving across an enormous range of conditions. It is worth sitting with that contrast for a moment, because it will illuminate almost everything that follows. The economic life of pre-contact North America was far more varied and sophisticated than the European observers who first encountered it were equipped to recognize, partly because they were looking for something that matched their own economic categories and missing what was actually there. The Europeans were familiar with market economies, systems in which goods were exchanged through price mechanisms, where value was calculated in money, where the accumulation of individual wealth was a primary driver of economic behavior. They were also familiar with feudal economies, where wealth was extracted from agricultural laborers through obligation rather than market exchange. These were the frameworks they brought to the encounter, and, unsurprisingly, they struggled to understand economic systems organized around entirely different principles. Gift economies were common across many indigenous North American societies. In a gift economy, the primary mechanism for distributing wealth is not market exchange, but gift giving, and the social logic is roughly inverted from that of a market economy. In a market economy, individual accumulation is the goal. Social status accrues to those who accumulate most. In a gift economy, generous giving is the mark of status. The person who gives the most is the most respected. The potlatch ceremonies of the Pacific Northwest were perhaps the most elaborate expression of this logic, events in which wealthy individuals and families demonstrated their status precisely by giving away enormous quantities of goods. The more you gave, the higher your standing. This was not mere generosity, any more than modern charity galas are merely generous. It was a sophisticated economic mechanism that served multiple social functions simultaneously. It redistributed wealth, preventing the kind of extreme inequality that tends to destabilize social systems. It created social bonds and obligations between families and communities, and it provided a form of insurance, since a family that had given generously in prosperous times could expect the community to reciprocate when times were hard. The trade connections between these diverse peoples were more extensive than most popular histories acknowledge. When archaeologists find Gulf Coast shells in burial mounds in Ohio, or Rocky Mountain obsidian in New England, or Great Lakes copper in the Mississippi Delta, they are finding the physical remnants of relationships that stretched across the continent. Ideas, ceremonies, and agricultural practices also traveled these networks. The spread of corn agriculture, from its origins in Mesoamerica to the northeastern woodlands, took thousands of years. But it happened, carried by trade, by migration, by the social networks that connected distant communities. This connected world had its own geopolitics, its own alliances and rivalries, its own diplomacy, and its own wars. The Haudenosaunee were not the only people practicing sophisticated diplomacy. The Cherokee had formal diplomatic protocols for managing relationships with neighboring nations. The Powhatan Confederacy of the Chesapeake was a complex, multilateral political entity that had been carefully constructed through a combination of alliance and force. The nations of the Great Plains were connected by elaborate alliance systems, trade relationships, and ceremonial ties that structured the political landscape long before European arrival. Trade networks across the continent were extensive and surprisingly durable. The Hopewell interaction sphere, a network of exchange that flourished in the eastern woodlands from roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE, moved obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, shark's teeth and marine shells from the Gulf Coast, and mica from the Appalachians, across distances of hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. These materials ended up in burial mounds and ceremonial deposits far from their sources, evidence of the long-distance connections that linked communities across the continent into a loosely integrated economic universe. The agricultural systems of the eastern woodlands and the Southwest were, by any objective measure, highly productive. The Three Sisters, polyculture, corn, beans, and squash grown together, was a product of centuries of selective breeding and agricultural experimentation that began in Mesoamerica and spread northward. Corn, or maize, is one of the most remarkable feats of human plant breeding in history. Its wild ancestor, a grass called teosinte, produces a tiny cob with only a few seeds. Through thousands of years of selective cultivation, indigenous farmers transformed it into the high-yield cereal grain that feeds much of the world today. This transformation required systematic observation, deliberate selection, and the kind of multi-generational knowledge transmission that can only happen in stable communities with strong educational traditions. The Three Sisters system was not just productive in caloric terms, it was ecologically intelligent. Corn provides a tall stalk for the beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen from the atmosphere back into the soil, replacing what the corn removes. Squash spreads along the ground, shading out weeds and retaining soil moisture. The three plants together grow more efficiently than any of them alone and maintain soil fertility over time in ways that monoculture does not. This was not an accident. It was the product of careful observation and deliberate design applied over generations. When Europeans first encountered indigenous agriculture, many of them dismissed it as primitive because it did not use the heavy plow, did not rely on animal traction, and did not look like European farming. They failed to understand, and in most cases were not curious enough to inquire, that the Three Sisters system was in many respects more efficient and more sustainable than the European agricultural system it appeared, superficially, to lack. It produced comparable or higher caloric yields per acre without depleting the soil, without requiring draft animals that consumed resources and required labor to maintain, and without the vulnerability to drought that monocultures with their shallow root systems tended to have. The economic and agricultural sophistication of pre-contact North America was real and substantial. It was not recognized as such by most European observers because they were operating with a definition of sophistication that required the particular institutional forms, writing, metallurgy, wheels, cities built in the European style that European civilization had developed, and they lacked both the curiosity and the humility to look for sophistication in forms they had not anticipated. Return for a moment to the Haudenosaunee, because their political and economic arrangements deserve more sustained attention than they typically receive, both because they were genuinely remarkable and because their relationship to what came after is so historically significant. Wars were part of this world, but they were generally not wars of conquest or extermination. Not because the people were naturally more peaceful than others, but because the scale and logic of warfare in a world of dispersed population limited agricultural surplus, and no standing armies made sustained conquest campaigns impractical. Wars were more commonly raids for captives, prestige, or specific resources, or the resolution of specific grievances through formalized combat. Diplomacy was as important as military capacity in managing relationships between nations. The political complexity of the pre-contact world is also evident in the way indigenous nations responded to European contact and colonization. They were not passive victims who simply accepted whatever was done to them. They negotiated, allied, played powers against each other, adapted, resisted, and in some cases temporarily drove European colonists back into the sea. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico expelled the Spanish entirely and maintained their independence for 12 years, is one example. The sustained military resistance of the Wampanoag under Metacom, King Philip, in New England in the 1670s is another. These were not people who lacked agency or the will to resist. They were people who were fighting against an adversary that combined overwhelming demographic replacement, epidemic disease, and continuous military pressure in ways that no previous enemy had done. The spiritual traditions of pre-contact North America were not primitive precursors to more sophisticated religious systems. They were mature, intellectually sophisticated traditions that had been developed and refined over thousands of years, addressing the same fundamental questions that every religious tradition addresses. What is the nature of reality? What obligations do human beings have toward the rest of creation? How should we face suffering and death? What is the right way to live? The political structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy rested on a foundation that was, by the standards of its time, extraordinarily sophisticated. The 50 chiefs of the Grand Council were not elected in the modern sense. They were nominated by the clan mothers, the senior women of each clan, and their tenure depended on their continued performance of their responsibilities. A chief who became arrogant, who prioritized personal interest over community welfare, who failed to maintain the good mind that the great law required, could be warned by the clan mothers, then warned again, and if the warning went unheeded, removed from his position. The clan mothers then nominated a replacement. This arrangement had several interesting implications. It meant that the real locus of political accountability was not the warriors or the men who held formal titles, but the senior women who nominated and could remove them. Gender relations in Haudenosaunee society were not egalitarian in a modern sense, but women held structural political power of a kind that had no equivalent in contemporary European political systems. In the mid-17th century, when the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a major player in the political landscape of northeastern North America, European women had no formal political rights and were legally subordinate to their fathers and husbands. The economic life of Haudenosaunee communities was organized around the longhouse, a large communal structure, sometimes 100 or more feet long, that housed an extended family group organized around the maternal line. The longhouse was not just a building, it was an economic and social unit. Resources were pooled, children were raised communally, elderly members were cared for by the extended family. The individual household, in the European sense, had no real counterpart. The basic unit of social and economic life was the clan and the extended family, not the nuclear family. This had profound implications for how economic security was organized. In the European system, individual households were ultimately responsible for their own survival. If the harvest failed or the breadwinner died, the family was in serious trouble unless they had saved enough or had access to charity or poor relief. In the Haudenosaunee system, the pooling of resources across a much larger group provided a structural buffer against individual misfortune. The grandchildren and the elderly and the sick were not a burden on a single nuclear family. They were the responsibility of the clan, which was large enough and resilient enough to absorb individual misfortune without catastrophic consequences. This is not a romanticized picture of a utopia without conflict, inequality, or suffering. The Haudenosaunee world had all of those things. There were wars, sometimes terrible ones. There were hierarchies of status and prestige. There were women who suffered abuse and men who abused their authority. The point is not perfection. The point is that the structural arrangements for managing these problems were, in certain respects, more sophisticated than what European societies of the same period had developed. The world of the Mississippian cultures, the tradition of mound building, corn-based agriculture, and ranked chiefdom society that Cahokia represented at its peak was still very much alive across the southeastern and midwestern United States in 1491, even if the great city of Cahokia itself had long since been abandoned. The answers these traditions offered were often radically different from the answers of the Abrahamic religions that the European colonists carried. But different is not the same as less sophisticated. In some respects, the indigenous spiritual traditions of North America were asking questions and developing answers that European philosophy would not arrive at until much later, if it has arrived at them at all. Take the question of the relationship between human beings and the rest of the natural world. The dominant European Christian theology of the colonization period placed human beings at the top of a hierarchy of creation, uniquely endowed with reason and an immortal soul, set apart from and above the rest of nature. Nature was, in this view, the raw material of human civilization, a resource to be used, a wilderness to be tamed, a chaos to be ordered by human labor and intelligence. The Protestant work ethic, which Max Weber famously connected to the rise of capitalism, had deep roots in this theology. To leave land uncultivated was to waste God's gift, to fail in the duty of improvement. Most indigenous spiritual traditions started from a fundamentally different premise. The world was not hierarchical, it was relational. Human beings were not above the rest of creation. They were part of it, embedded in it, dependent on it, and obligated to it. Animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and weather systems were not objects to be used, but subjects with their own existence and their own claims. The bear was not just a source of meat and hide. The bear was a relative, a being with its own power and dignity, to whom gratitude and respect were owed, and from whom permission was implicitly sought when it was hunted. The Mississippian tradition produced not one, but dozens of significant political centers across the Southeast, each organized around a central mound complex that served as the residence of the paramount chief and the setting for public ceremonies. Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, Spiro in Oklahoma, Aztalan in Wisconsin. These and others were centers of population, trade, and political authority that connected the southeastern quarter of North America into a loosely integrated world of shared symbols, shared trade goods, and shared political forms. The economies of these Mississippian chiefdoms were redistribution economies, a form of economic organization that sits conceptually between the pure gift economy and the market economy. In a redistribution economy, surplus production flows upward to a central authority, the paramount chief and their retinue. who then redistributes it outward through feasting, gifts to subordinate chiefs, and support for public works and ceremonies. The chiefs' power rested on their ability to attract surplus, demonstrate generosity, and maintain the ceremonial and religious functions that justified their elevated status. This system required agricultural productivity sufficient to generate the surpluses that redistribution demanded. It also required a political ideology that gave ordinary people a reason to accept the upward flow of surplus, an ideology that was, in the Mississippian case, provided by the cosmological and spiritual authority of the chief, who was understood to stand at the intersection of the human and divine worlds, and whose ritual activities were understood to be essential for the fertility and prosperity of the whole community. The chief who performed the ceremonies correctly, maintained the cosmic order, and redistributed wealth generously was a legitimate authority. The chief who failed at any of these things could expect to be replaced. This kind of ideological legitimation of economic inequality, the idea that hierarchy is divinely ordained, that the prosperity of the community depends on the correct performance of certain ritual functions by certain specially endowed individuals, will appear again in the story we are following. It appears, in fact, in every major civilization this history will touch. The specific content of the ideology changes. The structural function remains the same. Zoom out from North America for a moment, because the story of the pre-contact Americas cannot be told without acknowledging the civilizations to the south, both because they were themselves extraordinary and because their destruction was part of the same catastrophe that would reshape the North. In central Mexico, the Aztec Triple Alliance, formed in 1428 through a coalition of 3 city-states in the Valley of Mexico, had by 1491 built one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, sat on an island in the middle of a shallow lake, connected to the surrounding lakeshore by causeways, supplied by a sophisticated system of aqueducts that brought fresh water from springs on the hillsides, and surrounded by floating agricultural gardens called chinampas that could produce multiple harvests per year. The population of Tenochtitlan at its peak estimates vary, but most scholars place it somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. Made it one of the 5 largest cities on Earth, comparable to Constantinople, and significantly larger than any city in Western Europe. This relational cosmology had practical consequences that European observers sometimes noticed and then misunderstood. Indigenous hunters who apologized to animals before killing them were not being naive or superstitious. They were enacting a philosophy of reciprocal relationship that recognized the moral weight of taking a life. The ceremonies that preceded hunting, fishing, or plant harvesting were not mere ritual. They were expressions of a worldview that understood human consumption as embedded in a web of obligations that required acknowledgement and gratitude. The concept of sacred geography, the understanding that specific places have spiritual significance, power, and meaning that transcends their physical characteristics, was widespread across North American traditions and is deeply challenging to European legal frameworks that understand land purely as property. When a nation says that a particular mountain is sacred, they are not making a recreational preference claim. They are making a theological claim that this place is a living presence with its own power, that ceremonies have been conducted here for generations that give the place its meaning, and that the place gives the ceremonies their efficacy, that to destroy or desecrate this place is not merely to damage property, but to rupture a relationship that has been built over centuries. The concept of land as sacred place, as spiritually charged and meaning-saturated, is essentially incommensurable with the concept of land as commodity. The two frameworks cannot be fully translated into each other. This incommensurability is one of the deepest sources of the ongoing conflicts over indigenous land rights, sacred sites, and treaty obligations that continue to surface in American courts and politics to this day. The legal system operates within a framework that understands land as property. Many indigenous traditions operate within a framework that understands land as relationship. The two frameworks will occasionally produce compatible conclusions by different routes. More often, they produce fundamental, unresolvable disagreements about what land is and who can claim authority over it. The markets of Tenochtitlan, which Spanish soldiers who saw them in 1519 described with astonishment and envy, traded goods from across Mesoamerica and beyond: cacao, cotton, rubber, jade, obsidian, gold, copper, feathers of rare tropical birds, dried fish, fresh vegetables, salt, pottery, cloth, paper. One early Spanish observer estimated that the central market of Tlatelolco Tenochtitlan's commercial district drew 60,000 buyers and sellers on busy days. The market was regulated. Prices were supervised by officials who could adjudicate disputes, and the whole system operated with a complexity and efficiency that the Spaniards, coming from one of Europe's most commercially active economies, found impressive. In South America, the Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together, was at its peak in the late 15th century, the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, and one of the largest empires in the world. It stretched some 4,000 miles along the western coast of South America, from what is now southern Colombia to what is now northern Argentina, encompassing an enormous variety of ecological zones and incorporating dozens of distinct ethnic and linguistic groups under a single administrative umbrella. The Inca built a road network of over 25,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth: mountain passes, desert coasts, tropical forests, and maintained this network with relay runners who could carry messages from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days. These were not simple societies. They were complex, large-scale political entities with sophisticated administrative systems, impressive engineering capabilities, and rich cultural traditions. Their destruction was not the elimination of backwardness by progress. It was the destruction of civilizations by other civilizations, driven by the particular combination of military technology, epidemic disease, and ideological justification that the European expansion made possible. There is one more aspect of pre-contact North America that deserves extended treatment before we arrive at the collision, because it is an aspect that has been systematically misrepresented for so long that the misrepresentation has itself become a kind of foundational myth: the question of land management. The dominant European narrative about North American land before contact was that it was wild, untouched, unmodified in its natural state. This narrative served obvious ideological purposes. If the land was wild, then indigenous peoples were not really using it in the sense that European law recognized. They were not improving it, not investing labor in it in ways that counted. And if they were not using it in this recognized sense, then European claims to it were more easily justified. The narrative was false. Indigenous peoples across North America had been actively managing their landscapes for thousands of years, and the continent that Europeans encountered was not wilderness in any natural sense. It was a managed landscape, a product of human intention and labor, just in ways that European observers were not equipped to recognize. The most widespread and consequential form of this landscape management was fire. The deliberate, systematic use of fire, burning sections of forest and grassland on regular schedules, was practiced by indigenous peoples across virtually the entire continent. The purposes were multiple and well understood by those who practiced them. Fire cleared undergrowth and made travel easier. It maintained the open meadows and park-like forest conditions that the deer and elk that were hunted preferred to dense, unbroken forest. It encouraged the growth of berries and other food plants that were more productive in open conditions than in shade. It reduced the fuel loads that could turn small, manageable natural fires into uncontrollable conflagrations. And it maintained the ecological diversity of the landscape at a level that supported the maximum abundance of the plants and animals that human communities depended on. When Europeans first traveled through the interior of North America, they frequently commented on the park-like quality of the landscape, the open forests with grassy understories, the meadows full of deer, the abundant game, the productive berry patches. They attributed this to the natural abundance of the continent. What they were actually observing was the result of thousands of years of deliberate management. The landscape they found beautiful and resource-rich was a cultural artifact. It was the result of indigenous labor and intelligence applied over generations. The eastern forests of North America at the time of European contact were not the dense, dark, impenetrable jungle of popular imagination. They were, in many areas, relatively open, with clear sightlines of hundreds of yards, maintained by regular burning. The Connecticut River Valley, the Hudson River Valley, the Shenandoah Valley, these were not pristine wildernesses. They were managed landscapes, shaped by human intention into the productive forms that European settlers would later appropriate and transform through entirely different methods. When European settlers moved into these areas and, in many cases, stopped the burning that indigenous peoples had practiced for generations, the landscape changed. The undergrowth returned. The forests closed in. The deer populations, deprived of the open habitat they preferred, declined. The berry patches shaded over. The landscape reverted toward what it would have been without human management, which was, in many cases, substantially less productive and less diverse than what the colonists had found when they arrived. This is a small but telling example of a larger pattern. The European settlers did not find a wilderness and make it productive. They found a managed landscape, displaced the people who managed it, and then spent generations dealing with the ecological consequences of that displacement. The question of how many people lived in the Americas before European contact is not just a demographic curiosity. It carries enormous moral and political weight, which is why it has been debated with such intensity. The low estimates, which placed the pre-contact population of the entire Western Hemisphere at around 8 to 15 million people, were developed primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries by scholars who, in many cases, had intellectual stakes in minimizing the scale of the indigenous world. If there were very few people here, then the European arrival was not a catastrophe on a civilizational scale. It was a relatively small demographic adjustment. The low estimates also made it easier to sustain the empty land narrative that colonial land claims depended on. The high estimates, which place the pre-contact population of the Western Hemisphere at between 50 and 100 million people, with the North American population alone, somewhere between 10 and 20 million, emerged from more careful archaeological work, more sophisticated demographic modeling, and, importantly, a greater willingness to take indigenous oral traditions seriously as historical sources rather than dismissing them as myth. The scholarly consensus has moved steadily toward the higher estimates over the past several decades. The evidence from archaeological sites, from the analysis of pollen records and other environmental proxies, from careful reading of early European contact accounts, and from the reconstruction of disease mortality rates, all point toward a pre-contact population that was substantially larger than the early low estimates suggested. This matters for reasons that go beyond scholarship. If the pre-contact population of the Americas was 50 to 100 million people, and if by the year 1650 that population had been reduced to approximately 10 million, which is the range that most scholars now accept, then what happened between 1492 and 1650 was one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history, not a natural disaster, not an inevitable consequence of contact, a catastrophe with specific causes, specific mechanisms, and specific human agents and decisions. Understanding that scale is not an exercise in guilt, it is an exercise in accuracy. You cannot understand what the United States is and how it came to be what it is without understanding what was destroyed in the process of making it. The greatness that was built here was built on the ruins of greatness that was destroyed. Both things are true, and holding both simultaneously is what honest history requires. Let us close Act 1 by trying to imagine, as concretely as possible, what North America felt like on the eve of contact. Not as an exercise in nostalgia, the pre-contact world was not paradise, and romanticizing it does no more justice to its reality than dismissing it does, but as an attempt to make real what is about to be lost. It is the year 1491, a century before 1591. 5 centuries before 1991. The land that will become the continental United States is inhabited by somewhere between 2 and 10 million people. The wide range reflects the genuine uncertainty in the scholarly estimates, organized into roughly 600 distinct tribal nations, speaking somewhere between 300 and 500 distinct languages. These are not dialects or regional accents. They are languages as different from each other as English is from Chinese, each carrying its own grammar, its own metaphors, its own ways of encoding the particular knowledge and experience of the people who speak it. Along the Atlantic coast, from what will become Maine to what will become Florida, agricultural and fishing communities maintain villages and towns from which they manage the forests, estuaries, and farmlands of the coastal plain. The Wampanoag of what will become Massachusetts are farming, fishing, and living in permanent villages, with council houses and ceremonial grounds. The Powhatan Confederacy of what will become Virginia is a complex political entity of 30 or so Algonquian-speaking nations, governed by a paramount chief, a Mennonitic who controls trade, arbitrates disputes between member nations, and manages relationships with more distant peoples. The Cherokee in the southern Appalachians are in the middle of a centuries-long process of refinement that has produced a highly organized, town-based society with a sophisticated legal and ceremonial tradition. In the interior, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is functioning as a regional power, its council fires burning at Onondaga, its warriors and diplomats moving through the northeastern woodlands with an authority that is recognized and respected by neighboring nations, whether they are allied with the Confederacy or not. In the Great Lakes region, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, that will later form their own alliance, the Council of Three Fires, are managing the fur-bearing forests and wild rice beds of the Great Lakes country with the accumulated knowledge of many generations. On the Great Plains, the horse has not yet returned. Spanish explorers will reintroduce it in the 16th and 17th centuries, and its arrival will transform plains cultures so dramatically that the horseback hunter-warrior image that most people today associate with plains Indians is largely a product of the post-contact period. In 1491, the plains nations are semi-sedentary, farming along river valleys, making seasonal forays onto the grasslands for buffalo hunts conducted on foot, using carefully organized communal drives that required coordination and planning of a complexity that their later equestrian descendants would not exceed. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples are living in multi-story stone and adobe towns, farming with irrigation in a desert environment, maintaining trade connections with Mesoamerica to the south and with the Plains peoples to the east. The Navajo and Apache are relative newcomers to the region, having migrated southward from the far north within the past few centuries, and are in the process of adapting their originally forager lifestyles to the new environment in ways that will, over the next 2 centuries, produce the distinctive agricultural and pastoral cultures they are known for today. On the California coast, dozens of small nations maintain what is, by global standards, an extraordinarily high population density for a forager economy, an anomaly explained by the exceptional productivity of the California environment, where the diversity of plant and animal resources is so great that intensive gathering can support population densities usually associated with agriculture. The Chumash of the Santa Barbara Channel are notable for their sophisticated plank canoes, tumals, which they use to fish and travel on the open ocean with a seamanship that genuinely impressed the Spanish explorers who later encountered them. In the Pacific Northwest, the autumn salmon runs are at their height. Millions of salmon are returning from the ocean to spawn in the rivers of the northwest coast, and the peoples of the region are harvesting, drying, and smoking the fish in quantities that will sustain them through the winter. This annual abundance is the ecological foundation of the complex, hierarchical, artistically rich cultures of the northwest coast. Cultures in which the salmon is not just food, but a spiritual presence, a being with its own power and dignity, to whom thanks must be given, and from whom permission must be asked. It is autumn. The leaves are turning in the northeast. The corn harvest is being brought in across the agricultural midlands. The salmon are running in the northwest. The buffalo are beginning to move southward ahead of the approaching winter. 10,000 years of accumulated human history, knowledge, and culture are alive on this continent, carrying in their memories and practices and ceremonies the wisdom of uncountable generations. In a few years, a decade, perhaps 2, the first sustained European presence will begin on the eastern fringes of this world. The disease will come first, invisible, spreading ahead of the ships. By the time significant European settlement begins in earnest in the early 17th century, the eastern seaboard will already have been devastated by epidemics that killed, in some areas, 70 to 90% of the population. The people who survived those epidemics would have watched their world come apart in ways that defied any existing explanation. Their healers could not cure this thing. Their ceremonies could not stop it. their understanding of disease, which was, like most pre-modern understandings, embedded in a spiritual framework, had no category for what was happening. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Communities that had maintained their ceremonies for generations could no longer remember the words of the prayers because everyone who knew them had died. The psychological trauma of this experience, not just the grief, but the epistemological rupture, the shattering of the frameworks through which the world had always been understood, is very difficult to reconstruct from the outside. But it is essential to try. Because the nations that Europeans encountered in the early 17th century were not the nations that had existed a generation earlier. They were survivors in various stages of trying to make sense of a catastrophe that had no precedent in their history and no place in their cosmology. That context, the context of a world already disrupted, already wounded, already struggling to survive, is the context in which everything that follows takes place. It does not excuse or justify what came after, but it is essential background for understanding how the particular catastrophe of European colonization unfolded as it did, and why the responses of indigenous peoples to that colonization took the forms they took. There is a discipline that historians sometimes call thinking backward, the practice of approaching a historical moment without the foreknowledge of what comes next, trying to see it as the people who lived it saw it, without the distorting clarity of hindsight. It is a difficult discipline because we always know how the story comes out, and it is very hard not to let that knowledge color how we interpret the events that led there. But it is worth attempting here, at the close of this first act. Because the people of pre-contact North America did not know what was coming. The Wampanoag, who were farming their fields in coastal Massachusetts in 1491, had no reason to imagine that within a generation their communities would be decimated by disease. The Haudenosaunee statesmen who were refining the protocols of the Grand Council had no reason to imagine that within 2 centuries their confederacy would be caught between 2 European empires, fighting a war that had nothing to do with them. The farmers of the Southwest had no reason to imagine that their descendants would spend centuries fighting to maintain their language, their ceremonies, and their land against a force of overwhelming demographic and military power. They were just living, doing the things that communities do to sustain themselves across time, farming, trading, governing, teaching their children, maintaining their ceremonies, telling their stories, arguing about politics, making plans for the future. The future they were planning for was not the one that was coming, and the civilization that was about to collide with theirs, the one sailing west across the Atlantic in the ships of Spain and Portugal and England and France, had no idea what it was about to encounter, any more than the people already here had any idea what was about to encounter them. Columbus went to his death believing he had reached Asia. The Europeans who followed him took decades to begin to understand the scale of what they had found, and centuries to begin to understand the cost of what they had taken. That mutual incomprehension, 2 worlds meeting across a gulf of language, cosmology, economics, and political philosophy that made genuine understanding almost impossible in the moment of contact, is the engine that will drive much of what follows. Understanding it clearly is the first step toward understanding the country that was built on that collision, and that lives with its consequences to this day. This has been Act 1. What we carry forward from it is this: the land that became the United States was, for at least 15,000 years, a fully inhabited, richly cultured, politically complex, and ecologically sophisticated world. That world did not simply disappear when Europeans arrived. It was destroyed. And the destruction was so thorough, so rapid, and so consequential that its echoes run through every subsequent chapter of the American story, all the way to the present. To begin the history of the United States in 1492 or 1607 or 1776 is to begin a sentence in the middle. The full sentence starts much earlier, and the meaning of everything that follows depends on understanding what came before. Now we move forward into the ships, into the collision, into the long, complicated, unfinished story of what America has been trying to become. The oral traditions through which indigenous knowledge and history were transmitted have often been dismissed by Western scholars as merely mythological stories rather than history, belief rather than fact. This dismissal has been challenged carefully and effectively by scholars in both indigenous and Western academic traditions, who have shown that oral traditions frequently encode accurate information about historical events, ecological conditions, and geographical features in ways that can be independently verified when other evidence is available. The Haudenosaunee traditions about the founding of the Confederacy, for instance, encode an account of a solar eclipse that has been used by some scholars to date the founding to a specific year with remarkable precision. Oral traditions from Pacific Northwest nations encode detailed accounts of tsunamis that match geological evidence from the archaeological record. Indigenous ecological knowledge encoded in oral traditions and traditional land management practices has been found, when studied carefully by ecologists and anthropologists, to contain detailed and accurate information about plant behavior, animal populations, and ecological dynamics that could only have been accumulated through centuries of careful observation. None of this means that oral traditions are identical to written historical records, or that they do not contain mythological and symbolic elements that require careful interpretation. It means that they are not simply myths, that they carry genuine historical and empirical content, alongside their spiritual and philosophical content, and that dismissing them as mere stories impoverishes our understanding of the world we inhabit. The economic life of pre-contact North America cannot be understood through the lens of European market capitalism, but neither should it be understood as a simple hand-to-mouth existence of gathering and hunting with no economic complexity. The reality was considerably more sophisticated. Consider the question of surplus. One of the standard claims in the European colonial narrative was that indigenous peoples lived at the margins of subsistence, always on the edge of starvation, unable to produce surpluses sufficient to support social complexity. The archaeological evidence has thoroughly refuted this claim. The Mississippian chiefdoms, the Puebloan communities, the nations of the Pacific Northwest, and many others were able to generate substantial agricultural and food surpluses that supported not only their own populations, but the specialized craftspeople, ceremonial leaders, and political administrators who did not themselves produce food. The question is not whether there were surpluses, but how those surpluses were managed and distributed. And here the differences from European economic organization are genuinely significant. In the Pacific Northwest, the potlatch was not simply a feast. It was the primary mechanism of economic redistribution, wealth management, and social contract maintenance in a region where ecological productivity was highly variable. The same salmon run that was abundant one year might be sparse the next. The berry crop that flourished in one village's territory might fail while thriving in a neighboring territory. The potlatch created obligations and expectations of reciprocity that functioned as a social insurance system. The family that gave lavishly this year could expect to receive lavishly when their own resources were temporarily reduced. This system was efficient in ways that market economists did not initially appreciate, because their models were not built to capture forms of value that are not denominated in money. The social capital generated by generous giving, the enhanced status, the strengthened alliances, the activated obligations, had real economic value in a world where survival depended on maintaining relationships with other communities. The potlatch was, in a sense, an investment in the social infrastructure that made economic life possible. The gift economy also had built-in limits on individual accumulation that the market economy lacks. In a potlatch system, hoarding, retaining surplus without redistributing it, did not enhance status, it undermined it. The wealthy person who sat on their accumulated goods, who failed to demonstrate generosity, who allowed their neighbors to suffer while their own stores were full, was not respected. They were shamed. The social pressure to redistribute was structural and continuous. This did not produce equality. There were still wealthy families and less wealthy families, powerful clans and less powerful clans. But it put a ceiling on the degree of inequality that was socially sustainable, because the cultural logic penalized extreme accumulation in ways that market logic does not. The long-distance trade networks that connected pre-contact North America deserve more attention than they typically receive in standard histories. The Hopewell interaction sphere, which flourished in the eastern woodlands from roughly 200 BCE to 500 CE, moved objects of great symbolic and practical value across distances of hundreds and thousands of miles. The copper workshops of the Great Lakes produced ornaments that ended up in burial mounds from Ohio to Kansas. The obsidian quarries of Yellowstone sent stone to craftspeople as far away as the Atlantic coast. The conch shells of the Gulf Coast appeared in ceremonial deposits in the Great Lakes. These movements were not simply the byproducts of random individual trading. They were structured by social relationships, by alliances between chiefly lineages, by the obligations that connected ceremonial practitioners across great distances, by the networks of kinship and marriage that tied communities in one region to communities in another. The Hopewell trade was embedded in a ceremonial complex, a shared ideology of death, afterlife, and cosmic order that gave the objects moving through the network their meaning and their value. This is a pattern worth noting. In most pre-market economic systems, trade is embedded in social and spiritual relationships rather than being a separate sphere of purely material exchange. The idea that economic activity is a distinct domain governed by its own rationality, separate from social obligation, kinship, religion, and political relationship, is a relatively recent and culturally specific development, one associated with the rise of market capitalism in early modern Europe. It is not a universal feature of human economic life. For most of human history, and for most of the people living in the Americas in 1491, economic activity was social activity, inseparable from the web of relationships and obligations that constituted community life. The agricultural systems of the pre-contact Americas were the result of some of the most consequential plant breeding in human history. The transformation of teosinte into maize, the wild grass of southern Mexico, into the corn that now constitutes a major portion of the global food supply, was a feat of selective breeding that required thousands of years of careful observation and deliberate cultivation. The same is true of the potato, which was domesticated in the Andean region of South America, and which, after its introduction to Europe in the 16th century, would help fuel the population growth that drove the European expansion of the 17th and 18th centuries. The tomato, the sweet potato, the chili pepper, the chocolate, the vanilla, the peanut, the squash, the bean in most of its varieties, all of these were domesticated in the Americas and introduced to the rest of the world after 1492. The ecological footprint of European cuisine before 1492 would be unrecognizable to anyone cooking in Europe today. No tomatoes in Italian food, no potatoes in Irish stew, no chili peppers in Hungarian cuisine, no vanilla in French pastry, no chocolate anywhere outside Mesoamerica. The world was fed, in significant part, by the agricultural innovation of pre-contact American civilizations, and this contribution is almost never acknowledged in the standard narrative of European expansion as the bringing of civilization to a barbarous world. The political economy of the Mississippian chiefdoms provides one of the most instructive windows into how complex societies manage the inherent tensions between central authority and local autonomy, between the demands of surplus extraction and the limits of what populations will accept, and between the ideological justifications for hierarchy and the practical realities of scarcity and ecological constraint. The paramount chief of a major Mississippian center, like Cahokia or Moundville, sat at the top of a hierarchy that could extend several levels downward. Below the paramount were regional chiefs who controlled subordinate communities and owed tribute in food, labor, or prestige goods to the paramount. Below the regional chiefs were local village headmen who managed their immediate communities and organized the collection of tribute from ordinary farmers. The ordinary farmers, at the bottom of this hierarchy, produced the agricultural surplus that fed the entire system. This hierarchical structure required constant ideological maintenance. Ordinary farmers had to believe, or at least to accept, that the tribute they paid was a legitimate obligation rather than simple exploitation. The ceremony and display that surrounded the paramount chief served this function. The elaborate costumes, the restricted access, the presentation of the chief as a cosmic figure whose ritual activities maintained the fertility of the fields and the regularity of the seasons, made the extraction of surplus appear to be part of the natural order of the world, rather than a political imposition. This is not unique to Mississippian chiefdoms. It is a feature of complex societies everywhere. The Pharaoh of Egypt was the intermediary between the human world and the gods. His temples and ceremonies were cosmically necessary, and the labor that built them was therefore a cosmic obligation rather than mere political coercion. The medieval European king ruled by divine right, his authority sanctified by God and the Church, making resistance to him tantamount to resistance to God's order. The modern state claims legitimacy from popular sovereignty and national identity, but maintains its authority through a combination of genuine service provision, cultural formation, and the ever-present possibility of coercive enforcement. The form changes. The function, finding a way to make the extraction of surplus appear legitimate to those from whom it is extracted, remains constant. Understanding this dynamic is essential for understanding not just the pre-contact Americas, but every political system that this history will examine, including the ones that still operate today. The Mississippian trade network also embedded economic life in religious and political relationships in ways that the European separation of economy and society obscures. The prestige goods that moved through the Mississippian exchange network, the copper plates, the shell gorgets, the fancy pottery, were not simply valuable because they were rare or beautiful. They were valuable because they were embedded in a system of relationships and obligations that gave them social and spiritual meaning. A copper plate received from the paramount chief of Cahokia was not just an ornament. It was a sign of relationship with that center, of incorporation into its ceremonial network, of access to its cosmological authority. When that authority collapsed, when Cahokia's paramount could no longer deliver the surpluses and the cosmic alignment that justified his position, the objects lost their source of meaning. And the political network that had connected a 1,000-mile region began to dissolve. As the local chiefs, who had organized themselves in relationship to Cahokia's authority, looked elsewhere for legitimation or asserted their own. The civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes were the most urbanized and politically centralized in the pre-contact Americas, and their destruction in the 16th century was so rapid and so complete that it stands as one of the most dramatic political collapses in recorded history. Understanding why it happened so quickly, and with relatively small Spanish forces, requires understanding both the specific vulnerabilities of the Aztec and Inca states and the particular combination of weapons, biological, technological, and psychological, that the Spanish brought. The Aztec Triple Alliance was, by the early 16th century, a large and powerful empire, but it was also a young one. It had been built in less than a century through a combination of military conquest and tributary relationships, and many of the peoples it had incorporated were not willing subjects. The Tlaxcala, the Totonac, and other nations that had been either conquered by the Aztec or were in hostile relationship with them saw the arrival of the Spanish as a potential ally against their Aztec overlords. Hernan Cortes, arriving in 1519 with roughly 500 soldiers, did not conquer the Aztec Empire. He organized a coalition of disaffected subjects and enemies that numbered in the tens of thousands, many of whom had their own reasons for wanting to see Aztec power broken. The epidemics that followed contact were, in their immediate devastation, even more decisive than the military alliances. Smallpox arrived in the Valley of Mexico in 1520, before the final Spanish assault on Tenochtitlan, and killed an estimated half the city's population in a matter of weeks. The epidemic decapitated the Aztec political leadership. The Emperor Cuitlahuac died of smallpox within months of taking power and created a demographic catastrophe that made organized military resistance far more difficult. The Aztec defeat was not the victory of superior civilization over inferior barbarism. It was the result of a specific combination of political fragility, indigenous alliance against a common enemy, and microbial warfare that the Aztec had no means of defending against. The Inca collapse had a different proximate cause, but a similar structure. Francisco Pizarro arrived in Peru in 1531 in the midst of an Inca civil war, a war of succession between two claimants to the throne, Huáscar and Atahualpa, that had divided the empire and exhausted its military capacity. Pizarro, with fewer than 200 men, was able to capture Atahualpa through a treacherous ambush, hold him for ransom, the famous ransom room filled with gold and silver to the height a man could reach, and then execute him anyway. The political and military vacuum left by Atahualpa's capture and death was so severe that organized resistance took years to coalesce, by which time epidemic disease and Spanish military pressure had already created a situation from which recovery was extremely difficult. What matters for our story is not the military history of the conquest in detail, but the scale of what was lost. Tenochtitlan was deliberately demolished by the Spanish and its materials used to build the colonial city of Mexico City on top of it. The temples were pulled down and their stones used for churches. The libraries, the folded bark paper books called codices, which encoded the astronomical, historical, and ceremonial knowledge of Aztec civilization, were burned, most of them, by Spanish priests who understood that the destruction of the books was essential to the destruction of the religion. They were trying to replace. Only a handful of Aztec codices survived. The loss is incalculable, not just to the descendants of the people who created those books, but to the world. We will never know what astronomical observations they encoded, what historical accounts they contained, what medical knowledge, what philosophical arguments. They were destroyed before anyone with the ability and the willingness to read them carefully had the chance to do so. This is one of the things that makes the history of the European conquest of the Americas different from many other histories of imperial expansion. The deliberateness and thoroughness of the cultural destruction. The burning of the libraries was not a side effect of military operations, it was a policy. The intent was not just to defeat a political enemy, but to destroy a civilization, to eliminate the cultural forms through which the conquered peoples understood themselves and their world, and to replace them with the cultural forms of the conquerors. The effect on the descendants of the conquered was not the simple disappearance of the pre-conquest culture. Cultures are more resilient than their destroyers tend to anticipate. Indigenous peoples found ways to preserve their knowledge, their ceremonies, their languages, and their identities under conditions of extraordinary pressure. Some knowledge was encoded in Catholic ceremonies, hidden in plain sight behind a Christian surface. Some was preserved in oral traditions that continued to be transmitted in communities where the priests and administrators were not present. Some was preserved in the landscape itself, in the names of places, in the practices of land management, in the songs that were sung while working the fields. The survival of indigenous cultures under colonial pressure is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of human resilience, and it runs as a counter-narrative through every subsequent chapter of American history. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were not simply overwhelmed and replaced. They survived, adapted, resisted, and in doing so, maintained a presence in American life and politics that continues to this day. The story of how indigenous peoples managed the North American landscape is, at this point in the early 21st century, one of the most actively developing areas of historical and ecological research. New evidence keeps accumulating from a variety of disciplines that the extent and sophistication of pre-contact landscape management was far greater than even the revised estimates of the late 20th century suggested. The fire management story is perhaps the most dramatic. New research, combining archaeological evidence, historical accounts, and ecological modeling, suggests that the extent of anthropogenic burning in pre-contact North America was extraordinary, that the landscape of eastern North America, in particular, was not a natural forest at all, in any meaningful sense, but a managed cultural landscape in which human burning had been the dominant ecological force for thousands of years. The open oak woodlands that European settlers found beautiful and profitable, easy to clear, already managed to maximize deer populations. With rich understory vegetation, were the product of indigenous burning regimes stretching back at least 3,000 years. When European settlement disrupted those burning regimes through the displacement and population collapse of the people who had maintained them, the landscape began to change. Succession toward denser forest proceeded. Species compositions shifted. Deer populations declined as their preferred habitat shrank. Some of what the European settlers interpreted as the natural decline of the land's productivity was in fact the ecological consequence of the removal of the human management that had created that productivity. In the first place, the ironies here are genuinely profound. European settlers interpreted the highly productive, easily accessible landscape they found as evidence of nature's bounty, a gift waiting to be exploited. They did not understand that the bounty they were exploiting was itself a cultural achievement, the product of thousands of years of indigenous labor and management. And then, when the landscape became less productive after their arrival, they interpreted that decline as further evidence that the land needed proper European-style management. The causality ran in the opposite direction from what they believed. Similar dynamics played out in the river systems. Indigenous management of riparian environments through selective harvesting, periodic burning of streamside vegetation, and practices that maintained the diversity and productivity of fish populations had produced aquatic ecosystems of extraordinary abundance. The salmon runs of the Pacific Northwest, the shad runs of the Atlantic coast, the sturgeon of the major rivers, were not simply natural phenomena. They were the product of human management that had maintained the conditions for their abundance over generations. When those management practices were disrupted, the fisheries declined, and this decline was then attributed to natural causes or, eventually, to the European exploitation that replaced indigenous management. The management of forests for specific timber species followed similar logic. Many of the great stands of white pine that European settlers found in the northeastern forests stand so thick and tall that the British Navy sent agents to mark the largest trees as royal property, reserved for the masts of warships, were not simply the result of natural growth in favored locations. They were the result of management practices that maintained the conditions in which white pine thrives. Open forest conditions, with minimal competition from shade-tolerant understory species, conditions that indigenous burning helped create. The beaver populations of northeastern North America populations, so abundant that the fur trade built on their pelts financed the colonial economies of 3 European empires, were also, in part, the product of indigenous management. Beavers create wetlands that support extraordinary biodiversity. Indigenous communities in the northeastern woodlands managed beaver populations, taking animals from some locations while protecting others, in ways that maintained population levels and wetland extent over long periods. The fur trade's demand for beaver pelts at a scale that went far beyond what the managed harvest could sustain was one of the first ecological catastrophes of the colonial period. What this expanding body of evidence tells us is that the North American continent in 1491 was not a wilderness. It was a garden, an enormously complex, continental-scale garden, cultivated by the accumulated labor and knowledge of thousands of years of human occupation. Its productivity, its biodiversity, its accessibility were not gifts of nature waiting to be discovered. They were achievements of civilization built and maintained by peoples whose contributions to the world they inhabited have been systematically under-acknowledged for 5 centuries. The demographic history of the Americas after 1492 is one of the most contested and consequential areas of historical scholarship, and it is worth spending some time on the methodological questions involved, because they are not merely academic. The numbers we use to describe the pre-contact population carry moral and political weight, and the history of how those numbers were estimated and revised is itself a history of changing assumptions, changing methodologies, and changing political contexts. The early estimates proposed by scholars working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the theoretical frameworks of social Darwinism and scientific racism were dominant in academic life, tended to be very low. The anthropologist James Mooney, working in the 1920s, estimated the pre-contact population of North America, north of Mexico, at around 1.15 million people. This figure was remarkably convenient for a particular political narrative. A continent with only 1 million inhabitants was practically empty, and the colonization of such a continent could be narrated as the filling of a vacuum, rather than the displacement of a significant population. The methodology that produced these low estimates was flawed in ways that are now widely recognized. Mooney and others working in this tradition used the population figures recorded by early European observers as their starting point, without adequately accounting for the fact that those observations were made after epidemic disease had already devastated indigenous populations. The populations that Lewis and Clark encountered in the early 19th century, or that the first colonial settlers described in the early 17th century, were not the pre-contact populations. They were populations that had already been through one or more rounds of catastrophic epidemic mortality. Using them as proxies for pre-contact populations systematically underestimated the scale of the demographic collapse. The revisionist scholarship, beginning in earnest in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s and 1980s, approached the problem differently. Scholars like Henry Dobbins, William Denevan, and many others used a variety of methods: analysis of early contact period accounts for evidence of epidemic timing and mortality rates, archaeological evidence of population densities, comparison with pre-contact population estimates for comparable ecological zones on other continents, and careful reconstruction of disease mortality rates to arrive at much higher estimates. Dobbins proposed a pre-contact population of North America, north of Mexico, of between 9 and 18 million people. Denevan's estimate for the entire Western Hemisphere was around 57 million. These higher estimates were controversial when they appeared and remain the subject of ongoing scholarly debate. But the direction of the revision has been consistent. The consensus has moved steadily away from the early low estimates toward significantly higher figures. The current mainstream of scholarship places the pre-contact population of the Western Hemisphere somewhere in the range of 50 to 100 million, with North America north of Mexico contributing perhaps 5 to 18 million of that total. The implications of these higher estimates are significant. If the pre-contact population of the Western Hemisphere was 50 to 100 million, and the population by 1650 was approximately 10 million, then the mortality rate over the first century and a half of sustained European contact was approximately 80 to 90%. No other demographic catastrophe in recorded human history approaches this scale. The Black Death, which killed approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe in the 14th century, was devastating enough to reshape European civilization permanently. The mortality rate in the Americas was higher than the Black Death, substantially higher, sustained over a longer period, and combined with simultaneous military conquest, forced labor, cultural destruction, and ecological disruption. The primary cause of this mortality was disease, specifically the suite of epidemic diseases that were endemic in Eurasian and African populations: smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera, influenza, plague, but to which the peoples of the Americas had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity. The mechanism of this differential immunity is not racist. It does not imply any genetic inferiority in indigenous peoples. It simply reflects the fact that exposure to diseases over generations creates selective pressure for inherited resistance. And the Americas had been isolated from the Eurasian African disease pool for long enough that this resistance had not developed. When Europeans arrived carrying these diseases, often without knowing they were sick, or without understanding that the diseases were transmissible, the epidemics that followed were not foreseeable or preventable with the knowledge available at the time. What was foreseeable and is morally relevant is what happened after the demographic catastrophe was understood, which was known by the end of the 16th century. European colonists observed the devastation of indigenous populations from disease. Some of them interpreted it as divine providence, as God clearing the land for them. Almost none of them asked whether the obligations of Christian charity toward neighbors in extremity applied to the dying peoples around them. Almost none of them altered their territorial ambitions in response to the catastrophe. The disease was a mechanism. The decisions made in its wake were choices, and those choices are subject to moral evaluation in ways that the diseases themselves are not. There is a passage in the writings of the Lakota holy man Black Elk, recorded by John Neihardt in the early 20th century, in which Black Elk describes a vision he received as a young man. In the vision, he sees the sacred hoop of his people, the circle that represents the community, the continuity of generations, the wholeness of a way of life broken. He sees his people scattered, lost, the old knowledge forgotten or suppressed, and he spends the rest of his long life grieving that brokenness and hoping, not entirely without hope, for some future restoration. Black Elk was describing something that happened to his people specifically. In the wars and the forced removals and the reservation system of the second half of the 19th century. But the image of the broken hoop captures something that had been happening to indigenous peoples across the continent for 4 centuries by the time he received that vision. The breaking was not a single event. It was a process, repeated in different forms across different times and places. As the Colonial and then the American project moved westward and northward and southward, incorporating and displacing and sometimes destroying everything in its path. To carry the weight of that history into an understanding of the United States is not to condemn the present for the crimes of the past, nor is it to declare the American project irredeemably corrupt. It is simply to be honest about the foundations. The soil that this civilization grows in is not neutral. It carries the memory of what was done to make it available. And that memory expresses itself in the politics, the legal system, the land tenure arrangements, and the cultural assumptions of the country in ways that are still being worked through. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy still meets. The Cherokee Nation still governs itself and manages its own affairs within the limits that federal law allows. The Lakota, the Ojibwe, the Navajo, and hundreds of other nations continue to exist as distinct peoples, practicing their languages and ceremonies to the extent that centuries of suppression have made possible, maintaining their relationship to their ancestral lands as best they can within the constraints of a legal system built on the premise of their disposability. Their continued existence is not just a political fact. It is a philosophical one. The pre-contact world is not simply gone. It persists in the people whose ancestors built it, in the land itself, which carries the traces of thousands of years of human management in its soil and its species composition. In the legal and political claims that indigenous nations continue to press in American courts, and in the growing body of knowledge developed through collaboration between indigenous knowledge holders and Western scientists about how to manage complex ecological systems in ways that are genuinely sustainable rather than merely productive in the short term. Understanding all of this, not as a source of guilt or of sentimentality, but as genuine historical knowledge about the foundation on which the subsequent story rests, is the precondition for understanding anything that follows. The story of the United States cannot be honestly told without it, and it cannot be told honestly with it if we treat it as mere prologue, as context before the real history begins. This is the real history. All of it. The 15,000 years, and the 50 to 100 million people, and the hundreds of civilizations, and the accumulated knowledge, and the managed landscapes, and the sophisticated political systems, and the spiritual traditions of extraordinary depth. All of it is the real history of the place we call the United States. The rest of the story is what happened to that history, and what, in ways we are still discovering, it continues to do. In the next act, the ships arrive. The world we have been describing begins to be destroyed. The process is not quick, and it is not clean, and its consequences stretch forward through every subsequent chapter to the present. But before we follow that destruction, it is worth taking a moment, the length of a breath, the duration of a pause between paragraphs, to simply acknowledge what was there, to let it be real and full and important in its own right, rather than merely as the backdrop to someone else's story. It was there, it was real, it mattered, and it matters still.